He was a struggling single dad, just trying to keep his little girl warm through another harsh Vermont winter. She was a pregnant woman, starving alone and out of options after a cold contract. Marriage ended without love. He didn't know it at the time. But the moment he opened his cabin door to let her in was the moment everything began to change. 5 years later, something miraculous would bloom from that act of kindness. And today you'll witness how love redemption and the smallest choice can rewrite a life forever. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet power of kindness, and in stories that warm the soul, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and stay with us until the very last word. You won't want to miss what happens next. The leaves had turned gold along the winding roads of northern Vermont, dancing in the wind like memories too stubborn to fall away completely. Jonah Whitaker tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old Ford truck, his jaw clenched against the chill that had settled deep into his bones. Autumn had always been his favorite season, until it became the loneliest as his 7-year-old daughter sat quietly in the passenger seat, hugging a stuffed bear to her chest. Her eyes followed the trees passing by, but Jonah could tell her mind was elsewhere. Maybe she was thinking of her mother. Maybe she was just wondering what was for dinner. He was just about to turn off toward the cabin when something caught his eye. A shape slumped near the ditch, barely noticeable against the amber landscape. "Stay in the truck," Jonah said, quickly pulling over onto the gravel shoulder. He stepped out and approached cautiously. A woman. Her coat was too thin, her face pale and strained. Her hands clutched her belly, pregnant and unconscious. "Ma'am," he called, kneeling beside her. No response. He checked her pulse, weak but steady. Jonah looked around. No sign of a car, no bags, nothing but the woman and the road, and the cold whisper of wind through the trees. His first instinct screamed for distance. He didn't do rescues. Not anymore. He had Rosie to think about, but the woman stirred, lips trembling. "Help," she whispered, barely audible. Jonah exhaled a long breath, rubbed his hand down his face, and did what he hadn't done for anyone in years. He lifted her carefully into his arms. The cabin sat at the edge of a harvested cornfield, its roof sagging slightly, its wooden porch creaking with every footstep. Jonah laid the woman on the old couch near the fireplace, stoking the hearth until the room filled with warmth. He found a blanket and gently covered her. Rosie stood nearby, wide-eyed. "Is she okay, Daddy?" "I don't know yet," Jonah said softly, "but she needs rest and food." He made soup, simple from leftover chicken and carrots. When the aroma drifted into the room, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened, hazel soft, unsure. She looked around, disoriented, then clutched her belly, as if checking to make sure the child was still with her. "You're safe," Jonah said, placing a mug of warm broth on the table beside her. "You passed out by the road. I brought you here." She blinked, tried to sit up, winced. "Where is here?" "My home," Jonah replied. "You're in Maple Ridge, just outside of town." There was silence, thick with caution. Finally, she murmured, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Jonah said, "but you need to eat, and then maybe tell me your name." A long pause. "Mara," she whispered. "Mara Delaney." That night, Jonah lay awake on the old recliner, his back aching, his mind spinning. He hadn't had a stranger in his home since his wife died 4 years ago. Not a woman. Not one who looked so lost, so worn. Rosie slept soundly in her room upstairs, but Jonah kept the fire going just in case the woman Mara needed anything, or tried to leave. In the dim firelight, Jonah studied her from the doorway. She was asleep now, curled on the couch, her hand protectively over her belly. There was something fragile about her, not just physically, like someone who had been holding herself together for too long. He saw the wedding ring missing from her finger, the scuffed shoes, the threadbare coat, and the hunger. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times since losing his wife. Jonah sighed. He didn't know what brought her here or why she was alone, but she was now under his roof, and that meant something, whether he liked it or not. The next morning, Mara tried to leave. "I appreciate what you've done," she said, swaying slightly as she stood at the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "But I don't want to be a burden." Jonah crossed his arms. "You'll collapse again if you walk out in your condition. I've been through worse." Maybe Jonah said, his voice firmer now. "But not here. Not while I'm standing in front of the door." Mara hesitated. Her chin trembled slightly, and for the first time, Jonah saw the tears she was fighting. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered divorced. "Because you needed help. That should be enough." She looked at him for a long moment. Something between disbelief and gratitude flickered in her expression. Then she turned, walked slowly back to the couch and sat down. "I'll stay." "A few days," she said. "Just until I can figure something out." Jonah gave a short nod. "That's fine. Rosie already set a place for you at breakfast." And just like that, without ceremony or promise, the cabin that once echoed with silence welcomed a second heartbeat. The scent of applewood smoke lingered in the kitchen air, mingling with the steam rising from a pot of oatmeal simmering gently on the stove. Jonah stood by the counter, slicing apples with practiced rhythm. The knife's soft thuds against the worn cutting board were the only sounds, aside from the ticking of the old wall clock and the quiet footsteps of Rosie, padding across the wood floor in wool socks. "She's still sleeping?" Rosie asked, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah," Jonah replied without turning. "Let her rest. She needs it." The little girl nodded solemnly, climbing onto one of the wooden stools. She looked sad. Like you used to." Jonah froze for half a beat, the knife hovering above a slice of apple. His daughter had a way of cutting straight to truth with no warning. "Maybe she is," he said, setting down the knife and stirring the pot. "Sometimes people carry sadness like a heavy coat, hard to take off." Rosie tilted her head. "Are we gonna let her stay?" Jonah looked over at her. "For now." "That's good," she said simply. "I think the cabin gets less cold when there's more people in it." Jonah gave a soft chuckle and kissed the top of her head. "Go set the table. Pumpkin." Mara woke slowly, the comfort of the warm blanket and the crackle of fire at her feet, making it hard to believe she was anywhere real. For a moment, she had the wild thought she'd dreamed it all, that the highway, the hunger, the collapse, had all been some awful memory she'd finally escaped. But then the soreness in her back reminded her, and the firm swell of her belly. She sat up, eyes darting to the open window. The morning light poured in through the curtain, casting gold on the hardwood floor. Her coat lay folded over a chair, her shoes neatly placed by the rug. A smell drifted in apples and cinnamon. Her stomach rumbled. She hesitated before walking into the kitchen. Jonah looked up. First. "Morning," Rosie waved. "Hi, Miss Mara. We made oatmeal." Mara tucked her messy hair behind one ear. "I don't want to intrude." "You already are," Jonah said flatly, then added, "Might as well sit down and eat." Mara blinked, startled, then realizing he was half joking, gave a faint smile and slowly lowered herself into the chair across from Rosie. The warmth of the food, the clink of spoons, the hush of the wind against the cabin walls, everything felt domestic, in a way Mara hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. She took her first bite and felt her eyes sting. "You okay?" Jonah asked, noticing the shift. "Yeah," she said, quickly brushing at her cheek. "It's just hot." He didn't press. Instead, he refilled her mug with tea and passed a plate of sliced apples her way. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable. More like the silence between people who had nothing to prove. Rosie chattered softly about her spelling test and how she thought the owl living in the tree outside had a name. Mara listened, smiled, and found herself drawn into a space that felt too kind to be real. After breakfast, Jonah returned to chopping firewood out back, while Rosie gave Mara a tour of the small, cluttered cabin. There were hand-carved figurines lining the windowsills. Little bears, raccoons, a fox or two, all shaped with surprising detail. "Daddy made these," Rosie said proudly. "He used to sell them, but now he just makes them for fun." Mara picked one up, a fox with a slightly tilted head. "They're beautiful. He says it keeps his hands busy when his heart is too quiet." Rosie added. Mara paused. She knew what that meant. She'd lived that kind of quiet. Later that afternoon, Mara stood alone on the back porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching as Jonah split logs with steady focus. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms knotted with strength and years of labor. There was no wasted movement, no frustration in the rhythm, just a calm, almost meditative purpose. "You do this every day?" she asked, as he paused for water. Jonah wiped his brow and looked over. "Keeps the house warm, and gives me something to do that doesn't involve overthinking." Mara smiled faintly. "That's a good reason." A long pause stretched between them. "I'm not used to people helping me," she said. "Finally." "I'm not used to helping anyone," he replied. They shared a glance, brief but meaningful. Two people who didn't ask to be broken, standing on opposite ends of healing. That evening, Mara helped with dishes. Rosie had gone to bed early, leaving the kitchen bathed in low lamplight and the sound of water running. Jonah dried the plates, placing them into the cabinet with care. "She's a great kid," Mara said, voice quiet. "She is," Jonah replied. "She misses her mom." "She does." Mara dried her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "What happened?" Jonah hesitated, the plate in his hand, suddenly heavier. "Car accident. She was coming home from town. Slippery roads. I was supposed to pick Rosie up from school that day. Emily offered. Instead, she never made it back." Mara nodded slowly, pain flickering in her gaze. "I'm sorry." "Me too," he said. "Not a day goes by that I don't think, maybe if I'd gone." She stepped closer, not touching, just standing near. "I think about things I should have done differently too. But I'm starting to learn, guilt is a terrible home to live in." Jonah turned toward her. "You got somewhere to be." "Mara," her breath caught. "No." "Then stay a while." He didn't say it with a smile or with invitation laced in sentiment. It was just a line of quiet acceptance, like the creak of the cabin floor or the softness of falling snow. Natural till Mara nodded. "Okay." And just like that, something shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but undeniably. The October wind blew colder that morning, threading through the cracks of the old cabin, like it knew every secret the walls had once held. Jonah stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug in hand, watching his breath drift upward into the pale sky. The maples beyond the field were nearly bare. Now, their branches stretched out like quiet prayers. Behind him, the cabin stirred with life. Gentle, hesitant life. Mara was still asleep on the couch, her frame curled around the growing roundness of her belly. Rosie had left early with the neighbor's teen, Emily Thomas, who sometimes drove her to school in exchange for gas money and eggs from Jonah's hens. The cabin hadn't been this full or this warm in a very long time. Jonah took another sip of coffee and forced himself to stop thinking. He spent the morning in the tool shed behind the house, repairing a broken latch on the old storage trunk. That trunk hadn't been opened in nearly 3 years. It contained the last of Emily's things. His wife's packed away in a haze of grief and silence. A few baby clothes Rosie had outgrown, a wedding photo with a cracked frame, a yellowed journal with 2 entries, and a ribbon bookmark. He hadn't touched it since the day he locked it. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he didn't trust himself with remembering. By midday, the latch was fixed. He didn't open the trunk. He just sat beside it for a while, letting the dust cling to his jeans. The silence wrap around his shoulders, like a question he didn't yet want to answer. Inside the cabin, Mara was folding laundry. Or rather, trying to. The folding part had never been her strong suit, but her fingers needed something to do. She didn't like sitting still. Stillness had a way of making thoughts louder. The morning had gone by, gently. No judgmental stares, no sharp comments, just warmth, a full belly, and a child's drawings pinned on the fridge. Simple things that for most of her life had seemed impossibly distant. She caught sight of a small embroidered cloth tucked in the laundry pile, a handkerchief old but neatly folded. On it, a sunflower stitched in fading thread, the kind of detail only hands in love or grief would make. She turned it over, and on the corner, faint initials. It didn't take much to guess who it had belonged to. She hesitated, then refolded it gently and set it aside. Later that afternoon, Jonah came in with dirt on his boots and a tired set to his shoulders. He paused when he saw her in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. "You're baking. I thought I'd try." Mara said, brushing her hair from her face. "Pumpkin bread. I had some left over from the soup ingredients." Jonah stepped closer, sniffing the air. "Smells like October. I was hoping it might," she said quietly. There was a silence between them, then not awkward, but not quite easy either, a kind of silence that waits. Jonah cleared his throat. "I saw you found the handkerchief." Mara turned to face him. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's fine." He pulled out a chair and sat. "It was hers. My wife, Emily. She made that the summer before Rosie was born." "It's beautiful," Mara said softly. She must have been kind. She was kind in a way that made people softer just by being around her. Jonah replied. "She used to hum while she worked in the garden. I think the sun came out more on days she was out there." Mara smiled, then looked down. "I don't have anything like that from my past. No gardens, no embroidered cloths, just receipts and court papers." Jonah looked at her. "That doesn't mean you can't build something new." She met his gaze, and for a moment it felt like the cabin itself held its breath. That evening, while Rosie colored at the kitchen table, Mara stepped outside with Jonah to gather kindling. The air was crisp, fragrant with pine and fallen leaves. As they knelt beside the woodpile, their hands occasionally brushed. "You don't talk much about where you came from," Jonah said. "I don't know that there's much to say," Mara replied, tossing a stick into the basket. "Married a man for the wrong reasons. It was legal, but not love. He needed the image for his business. I needed a roof and health insurance. It lasted a year when the contract ended, so did the support. And now, he doesn't know I'm pregnant," she said, eyes on the ground. "I didn't want anything from him. Still don't." Jonah didn't respond right away. The last log dropped into the basket with a dull thud. "You deserve better," he said quietly. Mara looked at him, something fragile breaking in her expression. "I don't know if I believe that yet." "Well," Jonah said, lifting the basket, "maybe staying here a while will help you remember how to—" That night, long after Rosie had gone to sleep, and the house had gone quiet, Mara sat by the fire flipping through an old photo album she found on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. Pictures of Rosie as a baby, her chubby hands covered in birthday cake. A young Jonah smiling beside Emily beneath a maple tree, her hair catching sunlight like a curtain of fire. There was love in every photo unspoken, but loud as thunder in her chest. Jonah appeared at the doorway. Couldn't sleep. Mara closed the album gently. I didn't mean to snoop. You're not. I used to look through it every night, until one day I couldn't anymore. He sat beside her, not too close, but close enough. Do you think it's possible to feel safe in a place that isn't yours? She asked. Jonah's voice was a low murmur. Sometimes it becomes yours the moment you stop running from it. They didn't say anything after that, just sat listening to the fire crackle and the wind outside whispering through the eaves. Not lovers, not strangers, just two people broken differently, sharing the same quiet night. The wind that night was restless. It whistled low through the gaps in the cabin walls, nudging the old shutters to creak like a tired song. The fire in the hearth had begun to die down, casting flickers of gold and shadow across the hand-hewn beams. Above, Mara sat, curled up in the old armchair, a quilt pulled around her shoulders. Her tea had long since gone cold, untouched, on the side table. She couldn't sleep. Not from discomfort. Jonah had given her the couch, his kindness as steady as the ticking clock, but because something in the air stirred a part of her she hadn't felt in years, that strange, aching place where longing met memory. She rose quietly, stepping softly on the old pine floors. The room was dark, except for the firelight. On a whim, she wandered to the far end of the living room, where a small antique radio rested on a shelf beneath the window. Its wood was scratched, its dials worn from decades of use. She reached for the power knob, not knowing what she was looking for. Only that silence no longer felt like company, but something colder. The dial buzzed to life, a hiss of static, a brief burst of a baseball game, then the falling leaves drift by the window. Mara froze. The voice was old, velvety, almost ghostly. Nat King Cole. The autumn leaves of red and gold. The melody filled the cabin, soft and unassuming, but within seconds, it felt like the walls themselves remembered. Jonah stepped into the doorway, drawn by the sound. His body tensed. His hand gripped the frame. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Mara turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. I didn't mean to. He held up a hand. Don't turn it off, he said quietly. He crossed the room, like someone walking through snow, carefully, reverently, as though afraid any wrong move would shatter what held him together. He sank into the chair opposite hers, not taking his eyes off the fire. That song, he said, almost to himself. Emily used to play it every fall. She'd hum it while cooking, or folding laundry, or dancing with Rosie in the kitchen. I always thought it was just background noise. Until the day it wasn't, Mara said nothing. The fire cracked a log, shifting with a soft sigh. Everybody died in November. Jonah continued. I remember driving home from the hospital. Numb, I turned on the radio, and that was the song playing. I had to pull over. I couldn't see the road. His voice broke. Just slightly, Mara watched him with quiet reverence. Not pity, not fear. Just presence. I never played it again, he added. Until now, she whispered. I didn't know. You couldn't have, he replied. But maybe I needed to hear it again. On a night like this, they sat like that for a long time. Two people marked by loss, not trying to fix anything, just letting memory pass through them, like wind through the trees. When the song ended, Mara stood and walked to the hearth. She knelt beside it, feeding in a few pieces of kindling. The fire crackled awake again, warm and new. Jonah watched her hand steady, purposeful. She must have loved you very much, Mara said gently without turning. I hope so, he answered. I wasn't always good at showing it. Mara faced him, her gaze steady. You took in a pregnant stranger with nowhere to go. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are. He looked away, jaw tightening. Maybe he said, but I've spent the last few years trying to be useful enough to forget I was lonely. That's the loneliest kind of useful, Mara said, voice barely a breath. He smiled, tired but genuine. You have a way of saying things people usually run from. I've had to live through enough of them to stop running. She walked back toward the chair but paused. Then, without overthinking it, she sat down on the floor beside his chair, resting her head gently against the side of the armrest. Not touching him, not asking for anything, just being near Jonah, looked down at her surprised, but he didn't move away. In fact, for the first time in years, he leaned into the closeness. Later, after Mara had gone to lie down, Jonah sat alone by the fire. The radio still hummed softly with low-volume jazz. The room was quiet, but not empty. He rose, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out the photo album. The first time in over 2 years, the leather cover felt worn soft at the corners. He opened to the first page. There she was, Emily laughing beside him under the old maple, her hair tangled in the wind, her smile wide enough to hold the sun. He let the tears come this time, not in shame, not in fury, just release. Then, with a deep breath, he closed the book and placed it on the coffee table. He didn't return it to the shelf. The next morning, when Mara came into the kitchen, the photo album was still there, waiting, and beside it, a fresh cup of tea. She looked up at Jonah. He just nodded. Something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than gratitude, more enduring than sympathy. Trust. The scent hit him. First. Warm, sweet, and unmistakable, Jonah stood at the bottom of the stairs, momentarily unsure whether he was still dreaming. It wasn't the smell of wood smoke or coffee, which he'd grown used to each morning. This was different. It smelled like October. Like before pumpkin bread. He walked into the kitchen and for a moment just stood there. The window above the sink bathed the room in amber morning light, and in that light stood Mara, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, flour dusting her cheek. She moved slowly, carefully, as though every motion was deliberate. Reverend Rosie sat at the table, legs swinging beneath her chair, nose practically hovering over the cooling loaf on a wire rack. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "You made that?" Jonah asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Mara looked up and nodded, a little self-conscious. "Thought I'd try. It's my mother's old recipe. I haven't baked it in years." But I remembered most of it. "Smells like fall," he said. "It smells like love," Rosie declared with conviction. They all chuckled, an easy, light sound, the kind that filled in the empty corners of a room without trying. Jonah poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching as Mara sliced into the loaf. The soft crumb gave way under the knife, steam rising rich with spice and memory. She handed him a piece without a word. He took a bite and froze. It wasn't just good. It was familiar. He swallowed slowly. "My mom used to make bread like this." Mara raised an eyebrow. Surprised. "Really?" "Yeah, not exactly the same, but close. She'd add cloves and drizzle a little maple syrup on top." He paused. "Haven't thought about that in years?" Mara smiled, a soft curve of understanding. "I guess kitchens remember things. We forget." They ate breakfast together, the three of them, like they'd been doing it for years instead of just days. No one commented on the shift, the way Rosie leaned her shoulder against Mara's as she ate, or the way Jonah passed her the butter without asking. These were the kinds of gestures that meant something when they happened. Quietly, Rosie licked her fingers. "Miss Mara, do you know how to make Christmas cookies?" Mara smiled. "I might. Can we do that soon? Daddy says we don't really decorate anymore. but I think maybe this year we should. It's cozier now. Jonah looked up at that. Is that so? Rosie nodded, serious. It feels like the cabin isn't sad anymore. There it was, the sentence that hit harder than anything else could have. Mara looked down her throat. Tightening, she reached over and gently smoothed Rosie's hair. Didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. After breakfast, Mara offered to help with chores. She'd always been self-reliant too much, so perhaps, and being idle made her nervous. So Jonah handed her a pair of worn gloves, and together they worked in the small garden plot, pulling the last stubborn roots of summer from the earth. The sky was high and blue, the trees nearly bare, the wind clean and sharp against the skin, the kind of day that made you feel alive simply by standing still. I forgot how good it feels to work with your hands, Mara said, dropping a pile of dead leaves into the wheelbarrow. Jonah nodded. It's grounding, she laughed lightly. Is that a dad joke? No. That was a woodworker's joke. We're a different species. They shared a glance, then looked away at the same time, the air between them humming with something that hadn't quite found its name. Later that afternoon, while Rosie played with her dolls on the porch, Mara wandered into the living room and found Jonah sanding a block of wood at the dining table. What are you making? She asked. He looked up, surprised to see her. A toy train for a friend's kid. Or maybe just for Rosie. She says the porch needs more passengers. Mara smiled, sitting across from him. Do you always make things with your hands when your mind gets noisy? Pretty much, he said. Wood doesn't lie, doesn't pretend you know where you stand with it. It breaks if it needs to. It bends when you heat it just right. And sometimes, if you work long enough, something beautiful comes out of a block that looked useless. He set the sandpaper down. I think people are like that too, she said. They held each other's gaze for a long, quiet moment, not searching, not asking, just being seen. That evening, after Rosie had gone to bed, Mara found Jonah on the back porch, staring up at the stars. I made tea. She offered, handing him a mug. He took it without a word, then gestured for her to sit beside him on the wooden bench. The night was cool, but not bitter. The kind of chill that made you lean into your coat and breathe a little deeper. I've never had a Thanksgiving, Mara said softly. Jonah looked over. Never. My mother left when I was little. My dad wasn't around much. Holidays were just days without school. He was quiet for a while, then said, We used to make a fire outside on Thanksgiving Eve. Emily said it was her way of honoring the warmth that comes before the cold. Mara smiled faintly. That sounds like her. You never met her, but I think I know her, she said. Because I'm getting to know you. Jonah didn't reply. He just looked out across the dark field, the stars reflecting in his quiet eyes, and Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. Not because she needed support, but because it felt like the most natural place to be. The first snow came quietly. Not the kind that demanded attention, but a gentle dusting, like the world had paused to exhale. The fields outside the cabin turned pale beneath the sky, and the trees, once blazing with color, now stood bare like bones. It was the sort of snowfall that felt more like memory than weather. Inside the cabin was warm. A fire danced in the hearth as he sat cross-legged on the rug, carefully cutting paper snowflakes to tape onto the windows. Mara watched her from the couch, her hands idle in her lap, her mind elsewhere. Do you like snow? Rosie asked, glancing up with a grin. I do, Mara said softly. It makes things feel clean, you. Like the world forgot its mistakes for a while, Rosie nodded solemnly. Daddy says, snow hushes everything. Even the parts that hurt. Mara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That afternoon, while Jonah was in town gathering supplies, and Rosie played outside bundled in scarves and wool mittens. Mara wandered into the spare room, the one Jonah had cleared for her a few days earlier. It was modest, a small bed, a wooden dresser, and a narrow closet, but it was hers. For now, she opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one she hadn't touched since arriving. Her worn leather bag sat inside, zipped tight. Mara hesitated before pulling it out, placing it on the bed. Her fingers trembled as she unzipped it, revealing a folded stack of envelopes, all the same size, all addressed in the same handwriting. To Eleanor Delaney, no return address, never mailed 23 letters. She picked up the first, its edges soft from being held too many times. Dated over the span of a decade, the letters were a chronicle of hope, anger, sorrow, a woman writing to a mother who never wrote back. She opened one. "Dear Mom, I don't know if this letter will ever find you, but I need to write it. Today, I turned 21. You weren't there. You haven't been there for any of them. I don't understand what I did wrong. Some days I pretend you're dead. It's easier than believing you chose not to love me. But then I see someone, a woman laughing with her daughter in the park, and it guts me. I wonder if you ever think about me. Do you remember my voice? My hair? Am I still your daughter?" Mara closed the letter quickly, as if it had burned her fingers. She sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the stack close to her chest. She hadn't meant to stay this long at Jonah's. She certainly hadn't meant to feel anything like peace, but something about the warmth of the cabin, the soft rhythm of Rosie's laughter, the way Jonah looked at her without asking for anything. It made all the years she'd carried those letters feel heavier and real. She opened another. "Dear Mom, I'm pregnant." His name was Nolan. It wasn't love, not really. It was survival. I made choices I'm not proud of. I needed a roof. He needed a wife on paper. I thought maybe it would be enough to fix me. It wasn't. The contract ended. He's gone, and I'm alone again. But for the first time, I don't want to run. I want to stay still. I want to make a place for this child. A real place. I don't know how. But I wish you could see me trying. A knock at the door startled her. Jonah stood there, snowflakes clinging to his flannel sleeves. "Hey," he said gently. "Rosie's asking for hot cocoa. She wants your help. Says yours is better than mine." Mara blinked back tears. "Give me a minute." He nodded, noticing the bundle of envelopes in her lap. His eyes softened. "You want me to take Rosie to her room for a bit? Give you space?" "No," Mara said, standing slowly. "Actually, I think I need the opposite." They sat by the fire that evening, the stack of letters between them. "I wrote them over the years," Mara said quietly. "To my mother. She left when I was 5. No note, no explanation, just gone." Jonah didn't interrupt. "I kept hoping I'd find her, or that she'd find me. I wrote when I graduated high school, when I got my first job, when I got married, when I got divorced, when I found out I was pregnant." She looked at him. "I never mailed any of them." "Why not?" he asked gently. "Because I didn't want to know the answer. If she didn't write back, because she never got them, I could still hope. If she did get them and stayed silent." Her voice caught. "Then it's just rejection." Again, Jonah reached out slowly and laid his hand over hers. "I don't know why she left Mara. I can't pretend to. But I do know. This your worth isn't measured by someone else's absence." She didn't reply, but she didn't pull her hand away either. Later, after Rosie had gone to sleep, Mara took one envelope from the pile. Just one. She placed it in the center of the kitchen table. "What's that?" Jonah asked. "A letter I'm finally going to send," she whispered. "Even if she never writes back, I need to stop being afraid of the silence." He nodded. "Then we'll find a stamp in the morning." Mara looked up, startled. Jonah's eyes met hers, steady. You don't have to do hard things alone anymore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, almost imperceptibly, Mara exhaled, and it sounded like forgiveness. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned a strange slate gray, and the wind howled through the valley with a voice that felt older than time. Snow fell fast and heavy, coating the porch steps, the fence posts, the fields beyond, in a thick, muffling blanket. It wasn't just a dusting. It was the kind of storm that shut roads, snapped branches, and reminded people they were still small in the face of nature. Jonah moved through the cabin with purpose. He'd seen storms like this before. He laid extra logs by the fireplace, filled pitchers with water in case the pipes froze, and lit the emergency lanterns Rosie had once called magic jars. Rosie sat cross-legged near the hearth, her eyes wide with both excitement and nerves. Is it gonna be one of the big ones, Daddy? Jonah nodded. Looks that way. But we've got everything we need. You and Miss Mara just stay cozy. All right, Rosie smiled. It's kind of fun, he ruffled her hair. Only if we're prepared. In the kitchen, Mara stood by the window, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Her face was pale. Jonah noticed. You okay? She hesitated. I think so. Just feeling a little pressure. Probably the weather. He looked at her carefully. Pressure where low, she admitted. It's been coming and going since this morning, but I figured it was Braxton Hicks. Jonah had heard the term before. Emily had them with Rosie. But his gut twisted anyway. You need to lie down, he said. Now, an hour later, the storm raged harder. Snow slammed sideways against the cabin windows, and the wind screamed through the trees like something lost. Power flickered once, then again, and finally went dark. Jonah lit the lanterns, the soft glow dancing along the log walls like fireflies. Upstairs, Mara's voice called out sharper this time. Jonah, he bolted up the steps. Mara was on the bed, face drawn tight in pain, one hand gripping the headboard. Think it's happening. She gasped. I think the baby's coming. Jonah's mind raced. You're early by how much? 3 weeks, she hissed. Not ideal, but not dangerous. He knelt beside her. Can you feel how far apart the contractions are? 6 minutes, sometimes 5. He checked his phone. No signal. The landline had gone dead with the power. Panic tried to rise in his chest, but he shoved it down. Rosie, he ran to her room. Pumpkin, I need you to be brave. Mara's going to have the baby tonight. Right here. Rosie's eyes widened. But she needs a hospital. I know. But the snow's too heavy. We can't get out. So I need you to help me stay calm. Can you do that? She nodded suddenly, older than her years. Stay warm. Stay in your room. I'll call if I need you. Downstairs, Jonah grabbed every clean towel he could find, a basin of warm water, and a pair of scissors sterilized over the stove. His hands moved automatically, but his mind spiraled with memory of Emily's labor, the soft urgency in the nurses' voices, the sterile brightness of the delivery room. This was nothing like that. This was wood and wind and fear. And yet something inside him anchored. You can do this, he told himself. You have to. For the next 2 hours, the cabin held its breath. Mara labored through the pain with a strength Jonah could hardly believe. She didn't cry out. She breathed, clenched her jaw, squeezed his hand until his knuckles turned white. He spoke to her gently, steadily, wiped her forehead, held her when the shivers came. You're not alone, he whispered over and over. You're not alone. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, a miracle unfolded. At 2:17 a.m., a sharp cry pierced the quiet, and then everything went still. Jonah blinked the child, warm and slick in his hands. He stared down, breath caught in his chest. A boy. He moved quickly, wrapping the infant in a soft towel, checking his breathing, rubbing his tiny back until the wails came stronger. Then he looked at Mara, her hair plastered to her face, tears streaming down, but a smile blooming that was unlike anything he'd ever seen. "You did it," he said hoarsely. "No," she whispered, reaching for the baby. "We did." He handed the child to her, and for a moment, time forgot to move. An hour later, Jonah stood in the doorway of the nursery, the same room Rosie had once slept in. As a baby, Mara lay in the bed, propped against pillows, her son nestled against her chest. Her eyes fluttered closed, not from weakness, but from peace. Rosie stood beside him, clutching her stuffed bear. Jonah leaned down and whispered, "Want to meet him?" She nodded. They tiptoed in together. Mara opened her eyes just enough to smile. "Rosie." "This is Emmett." Rosie reached out carefully, her small fingers brushing the baby's cheek. "He's soft." Mara laughed softly. "He is." Then Rosie looked up at Jonah. "Is he our family?" Now, Jonah's heart squeezed. He looked at Mara. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. He turned back to Rosie. "Yeah, Pumpkin," he said. "I think he is." The storm began to break by sunrise. The light outside the cabin was pale gold, reflecting off thick drifts of snow. The sky had cleared as if giving permission for the world to begin again. Inside the fire still glowed. A baby slept in the crook of his mother's arm, and a man who had once closed his heart now stood in the quiet, holding a bottle of warm milk and watching the future unfold, not loudly, but softly like snow. The snow melted in April. Not all at once, but slowly, shyly, like Vermont had forgotten how to be warm and was trying to remember. The fields behind the cabin, once buried under silence, now stretched green with new grass and trembling buds. The maple trees began to blush with the faintest signs of life, and the brook beyond the hill sang again. Inside the cabin, life had taken on a rhythm. Gentle, steady, Mara moved with quiet confidence. Now her steps, sure as she cradled Emmett against her chest. He was nearly 2 months old, wide-eyed and curious, with a head full of dark hair and a temperament somewhere between solemn and sweet. Jonah said he had an old soul, and Rosie had declared him the best brother in the universe. Rosie herself had blossomed. She read stories to Emmett in the mornings, built forts from quilts in the afternoons, and insisted on helping Mara with very important mothering tasks, like folding baby socks or choosing lullaby playlists. She clung less to her teddy bear and more to Mara's sleeve, not from need, but from affection. And Jonah had started whistling again. One morning, as sunlight poured through the kitchen window, Jonah stood at the workbench beside the wood stove, running his hand over a smooth cedar plank. It smelled like memories of tree swings, old barns, and Sunday afternoons. Mara leaned in the doorway, Emmett dozing against her shoulder. "What are you building?" she asked. He looked up slightly sheepish. "A crib." She blinked. "We already have one, I know," he said. "But it's store-bought, fast functional." He paused, tapping the wood. "This one will be made with hands, with time, like the old way." Her eyes softened. "Emily and I started a cradle, once he said, his voice quiet, before Rosie was born, but we never finished it. I put the pieces in the attic after she died. Couldn't look at them, couldn't throw them away either." He ran a thumb over the grain. "Last night I brought them down." Mara stepped forward. "Are you sure?" He met her gaze. For the first time in a long while, yes. As the days stretched longer, so did the hours Mara spent in the garden. It had once been a wild tangle of weeds and frost-bitten stalks, but under her care, and with Rosie's enthusiastic help, it began to come alive. Rows of carrots, herbs in wooden boxes, lettuce tucked beneath straw. She planted daffodils along the edge, whispering stories of her mother's garden. Even if she wasn't sure they were real, Jonah often watched from the porch. There was something about seeing Mara in the sunlight, knees in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, humming to herself that made his chest ache, in a way that wasn't pain, but longing. Not for the past, for the now, for the chance that maybe, just maybe, something broken could be made beautiful again. One night near sunset, Mara stood in the nursery with Emmett cradled in her arms. The new crib stood in the corner, handcrafted smooth as silk, the cedar polished until it glowed like amber. She traced the curves of it, tears prickling unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "You made this," she whispered to Jonah, who stood quietly behind her. "Finished it this morning." She turned to him, her voice thick. "It's beautiful." He shrugged, trying to play off the emotion rising in his throat. Rosie helped. She chose the carving on the headboard. Just above where Emmett would lay his head were 2 leaves, one large one, small, and a third just unfurling. Mara reached out and touched them, then turned and stepped closer to Jonah. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not letting me run, for giving me this." She looked up at him, eyes wide, vulnerable but unafraid. "I don't know what this is yet," she continued, "or what it's becoming, but I know I don't want to lose it." Jonah's voice was quiet. "Neither do I," and then, as natural as breath, he reached out, slid one hand behind her neck, and kissed her. Not urgently, not with desperation, but with reverence, like someone who knew the value of what he was holding. Later, they sat on the porch together, watching as the last of the light slipped behind the hills. Emmett slept inside. Rosie was drawing something by lantern light. She said it was a map of our hearts, but refused to explain further. Mara leaned her head on Jonah's shoulder. "Do you think this can last?" she asked. Jonah looked out over the land he'd once tended alone. I think he said slowly that things, which grow slowly, tend to last longest. She smiled. Like pumpkin bread, he laughed, exactly like pumpkin bread. They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, and everything they would in time. Spring had come softly, and with it, a new kind of hope. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, rooted, and in the heart of a wooden cabin on a patch of earth, once haunted by loss. Something quietly extraordinary had begun to grow. The knock at the door came just after noon, unexpected and out of place, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the easy hum of a spring afternoon. Jonah looked up from the kitchen sink, hand still damp from washing a bowl. Rosie had left out. Mara was upstairs with Emmett, singing softly. Rosie sat on the porch, coloring a picture of our family tree, which featured not only people, but also a chicken and what appeared to be a loaf of bread with eyes. The knock came again. 3 beats, measured, intentional. Jonah wiped his hands on a towel and opened the door. A woman stood on the other side, 60, maybe a little more. Tall, thin. Her coat was neat, her posture straight, but her eyes were restless, like someone who had traveled too far, without knowing if she'd be welcome at the end. "Can I help you?" Jonah asked. The woman swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I'm looking for Mara Delaney." Jonah stiffened. "Who are you?" A pause. "I'm her mother." Mara stood in the middle of the living room, frozen. She had come downstairs slowly, unsure what had pulled her from Emmett's side, only to hear Jonah's voice speaking with someone he didn't recognize. Then she heard the name, the impossible name. Now, as she stared across the room at the woman she hadn't seen in 25 years, the air seemed to thicken. The woman stepped forward, but only slightly. Mara. Mara blinked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. The older woman's eyes flickered with emotion. I wasn't sure I would either. Jonah stepped back to give them space, but he didn't leave. Not completely. I didn't come to disrupt anything. Eleanor said, I just wanted to see you. Once know if you were alive. Mara gave a bitter half laugh. That's rich. You left, remember. You didn't even say goodbye. I was 5. I waited by the window for months, I know, Eleanor whispered. No. Mara snapped, her voice cracking. You don't know. You don't know what it's like to grow up thinking you're not enough for your own mother to stay. You don't know what it's like to keep writing letters and never get a reply. She didn't notice the tears on her face until Jonah reached over and gently placed a hand on her back. I read them, Eleanor said suddenly. Mara looked up, stunned. What are the letters? I didn't know how to respond. I kept them all. Every single one. For years I've read them over and over. I memorized your handwriting. Your words. I didn't think I deserved to answer. Mara stared at her eyes wide. You got them. Eleanor nodded, her voice shaking. Yes, I got them. A silence settled over the room, heavy and raw. Then Mara asked very quietly. Why now? Eleanor took a folded envelope from her coat pocket and placed it on the coffee table. I was diagnosed last fall, she said. Stage 2 lymphoma. Treatment's been working, but it made me realize, if I don't come now, I never will. And I don't want to leave this world without at least trying to say I'm sorry. That evening, after Eleanor had gone promising she'd stay in a motel, not wanting to intrude, Mara sat on the porch swing, the unopened envelope in her lap. The sky was painted with soft purples and oranges, and birds called lazily in the trees. Jonah came out with 2 mugs of tea. Rosie's asleep, he said gently. Emmett too. Mara nodded, not looking up. He sat beside her, letting the silence stretch. She left me. Mara said it after a while. I thought I was over it. I thought moving on meant it didn't matter anymore. It still matters, Jonah said. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. She turned the envelope over in her hands. What if there's nothing in here that can fix it? Then maybe it's not about fixing, he replied. Maybe it's about releasing. Mara looked at him, then eyes glossy but resolute. I've spent most of my life carrying that abandonment like a shield. It kept people out. It kept me from trusting, from hoping too much. But lately, you, Rosie Emmett, you've made me want more, and that scares me. Jonah placed his hand over hers. Wanting more isn't weakness, it's courage. She exhaled slowly, then opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter. Just 3 lines. My dear Mara, I left because I was broken. Not because you were. I've carried the weight of that mistake every day. If you ever find it in your heart to let me back in, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. There was no flourish. No grand explanation, just quiet. Truth. Mara folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. Then she whispered, maybe I'll let her try. Jonah pulled her close, resting his chin atop her head. Whatever you choose, he said. You won't walk through it alone. The lilacs bloomed in June. They framed the edge of the porch like soft purple lanterns, swaying in the breeze, sweetening the air. Rosie had picked a few that morning and placed them in an old mason jar on the windowsill. It makes the house smell like a lullaby, she said, and no one had found a reason to disagree. Inside the cabin, laughter echoed. Emmett sat in a high chair, cheeks sticky with mashed banana. Rosie fed him with exaggerated spoon-playing noises, while Mara tidied up the breakfast dishes. Jonah leaned in the doorway, watching them both like someone seeing sunlight after years of shade. The room was alive, not just with movement, but with purpose. Later that afternoon, Jonah walked with Mara through the back field. The wild grasses tickled their knees, and birds nested in the branches above. The old barn, once barely standing, had been cleaned out over the spring. Its roof patched its floor, swept its emptiness, now full of possibility. I keep thinking, Jonah said, hands in his pockets, about what it would have been like if I hadn't stopped that day. If I'd driven past, if I hadn't brought you in. Mara smiled softly. I wouldn't have blamed you. You had every reason to keep your door closed. He looked at her. But I didn't. And because of that, I got this. He gestured to the world around them, the cabin, the garden, the sounds of Rosie and Emmett playing in the distance. You gave us this too, she replied. He hesitated, then said, What if we could give it to others? Mara turned. What do you mean? Jonah took a breath. I mean, people out there are still where you were, on the side of the road, hungry, cold, alone. What if this cabin wasn't just for us? What if it became something more? The idea wasn't a plan. At first, it was a whisper, a seed, but once spoken, it grew fast. They called it Harvest House. A name, Rosie suggested, because, in her words, it's where people can gather the good things they thought they lost. The old barn became the first guest house Jonah and a few neighbors helped convert it, building bunk beds, fixing plumbing, even painting the walls, a soft sunflower yellow. They added a wood stove for warmth, shelves for books, and a play area for kids who needed laughter more than anything. The cabin itself became the main home. The Heart Mara ran the kitchen. Rosie helped with welcome baskets. Jonah taught carpentry basics to guests who wanted to work with their hands. They didn't call it charity. They called it belonging. The first family who came to stay was a woman named Claire and her 6-year-old son, Milo. They'd fled an abusive home 2 states away and arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a cracked ukulele. Mara met them at the porch with fresh bread and warm soup. Rosie gave Milo her old sketch pad, and Jonah showed Claire how to fix a loose cabinet door, not because it needed fixing, but because he saw the weight in her shoulders and knew what it meant to build something when your life feels like it's falling apart. Weeks passed. Word spread. More families came. A retired school teacher who had lost her home to foreclosure. A single father and his autistic daughter fleeing a toxic city life. A young couple expecting their first baby, barely out of high school. Each brought a story, and the cabin held them all. At night, Emmett gurgled in his crib while the fire flickered, and the sounds of quiet laughter drifted from the barn windows. It was no longer just a refuge. It was a community rooted in the kind of kindness that asks for nothing but multiplies everything. One evening, as twilight settled over the valley, Mara stood on the front porch, Emmett on her hip, watching the lanterns glow one by one across the field. Jonah joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. This place, he murmured, feels like a miracle. She nodded. Because it is. She paused. And so are you. He smiled, then turned to look at her. You know, I always thought healing was a private thing. Something quiet, internal. But I think maybe it happens faster when you give it away. Mara pressed her cheek to his shoulder. Then let's never stop giving. That night, Rosie placed a new drawing on the refrigerator. It was a picture of the cabin surrounded by tiny stick figures with smiling faces. Above it, in looping, crooked letters, was one sentence. Here we are never alone. And no one, not even Jonah, could argue with that. The leaves had turned again, just like they did every year, slow and golden, like the world remembering how to let go. The trees lining the dirt road into the valley flamed orange and red. The air carried the sweet scent of apple cider and wood smoke, and laughter echoed faintly from somewhere near the garden, where children played tag between hay bales. It was Harvest Day, a tradition that had begun almost accidentally 3 years earlier, when the first 3 families who'd stayed at Harvest House showed up one autumn afternoon with pies, quilts, and open arms. No one planned it. They simply came home. Now it had become something more. Every October they returned, not just those who had stayed, but friends, neighbors, strangers who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. There were no speeches, no stage, just food shared, hands held, and stories passed like heirlooms. Emmett stood at the edge of the old barn, a crown of braided corn husks slightly crooked on his head. At 5, he had Jonah's quiet eyes and Mara's unshakable calm. He held Rosie's hand tightly as she guided him toward the open clearing. "All set, little man," she whispered. He nodded, serious as a preacher. "Can I say the whole thing this time?" She knelt and adjusted his crown. "You practiced for weeks. You've got this." Mara and Jonah stood off to the side watching. Mara's fingers slipped into Jonah's. "This was your idea," she whispered. "No," he said. "It was ours. But he's the reason it all kept going." A small wooden platform had been set up beside the maple tree, the same one Jonah once built a swing on for Rosie when she was 4. Now it was strung with lights and bundles of wheat. Emmett climbed up with careful steps, clutching the microphone Rosie had turned on for him. The crowd quieted. Dogs barked in the distance. Babies cooed. Leaves rustled, but otherwise silence. Emmett looked out at the faces. Some he knew, Claire and Milo, who now lived 3 towns over, but still came every year. Old Miss Jeannie, the retired teacher, who taught him how to spell harvest. A tall man with a guitar, who once slept in the barn during the worst winter Jonah could remember. And some he didn't, but all of them looked at him like he mattered. He took a breath. "My name is Emmett," he said, the microphone making his voice just a little too big. "I was born in that house over there." He pointed toward the cabin. During a snowstorm, people chuckled softly. "My mommy says I was a surprise, but a good one. My daddy Jonah says I came to help him remember how to smile again." He paused. "This place helped a lot of people. It gave them food and warm beds and hugs when they forgot how to ask for them. So now I want to say something for all the kids who might come next." He unfolded a piece of paper from his pocket, trembling a little. Here he read carefully, "You are never too late to be loved. You are never too broken to be home." Then he looked up. "And if you're scared, that's okay." "We were too," he smiled, proud and calm, then climbed down, and the applause rose like wind through trees. That evening, as the sun dipped low and strings of lanterns lit up the pathways between cabins, Jonah and Mara sat on the porch. Swing, Emmett asleep in Jonah's lap. Rosie curled beside Mara with a blanket over her knees. "Think he'll remember this when he's older?" Mara asked softly. Jonah looked down at the boy in his arms. He might not remember every detail, but he'll carry it. In how he talks to people, in how he listens, in how he makes space for those who are hurting. Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted, for him to grow up knowing love wasn't something you had to earn." Jonah smiled. He's already giving it away like it's free. Just before midnight, as the last guests wandered off to their bunks or cars, Mara returned to the living room to blow out the candles. She paused by the fireplace. Above it, framed behind glass, was the embroidered handkerchief, with the sunflower once faded, now restored and stitched onto a quilt square. Below it, a brass plaque Jonah had made. From something lost came something whole. Beside it, hung Rosie's original drawing, the one she made 3 years ago, slightly yellowed now, but still bright. Here we are, never alone. Mara smiled, then turned off the last light. Outside, the leaves rustled gently, and somewhere in the dark, another soul hungry, hurting and unsure, was inching their way toward a cabin they hadn't yet found. But when they did, the door would be open. Duejaila Joan loiketinten hang, vakamksuk juak tiet kejak, biet chojoi twong, khan gia trong, nien va lon tuoi tren, YouTube giong, van gan guilich, suva mang tindantik kukjak, trong kwa ken. Soul Moment Story. We'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Share a comment below and tell us your thoughts about this story. Or simply say, hello. We read every message, and your words mean more than you know. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another moment of warmth, kindness, and hope. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, may your days be gentle, and your heart always find its way home.